Hi everyone, welcome back. Last week we looked at using samples, so recorded audio, to build up a drum beat. Today we're going to be delving for the first time into software instruments, so using MIDI to program our own drum beats by hand. Now this is an expansive and exciting area, but before we jump in, I'd just like to point out while we're on this screen here, that this drummer feature is off limits for the second assessment of this course. So for everyone using GarageBand or also Logic Pro, drummer is a feature that will generate for you a simple drum beat based on parameters that you set. So things like how complex it is or how loud and soft it is. And again, this is off limits for this second assessment, all about rhythm, because we want you to be building a beat yourself using either samples or what we'll be looking at today, which is software instruments and MIDI programming. So let's get into it. I've just got a blank project here and I'm going to select a new software instrument. The first thing you may see is this keyboard interface here. We'll come back to this tool in a minute, but first I just want to give a general explanation of MIDI programming and software instruments. So this track that we've created here, in contrast to the audio tracks that we've been working with before, doesn't actually play recorded audio data. So what we would have usually seen represented as a waveform, it's not a recording of actual acoustic energy. Instead, we can think of MIDI as programmed performance data. So basically us programming data, telling a computer how high or low to play a note, so in pitch, how long to play a note, so its duration, and then how hard to play a note, so its velocity or loudness. And this kind of performance data that we program can then be played by any type of software instrument. And this is an enormous departure from recorded audio, because it's much more flexible. So I could program in a melody, but it's not tied to a specific instrument. I could have a guitar play it, or a piano play it, or anything else. And so those instruments that play that programmed data, so our programmed MIDI data, those are what we refer to as software instruments. And to explain the workflow, the MIDI data is fed into a software instrument, which then performs it for audio playback. So if we come over here to these icons, this furthest left is the library icon, or we can press Y on our keyboard to toggle it on and off. And what this shows us is a pretty extensive built-in library of different software instruments that comes free with GarageBand. And we can go in and change this track here, so the instrument playing back our MIDI data, to be say a guitar or like a mallet instrument or anything orchestral, and then a whole bunch of different synths and more experimental sounds. But just to demonstrate to begin with, let's just go in and select a standard piano for now, and then we'll go ahead and program in some MIDI data for the first time. So there are a few ways to do that we'll be covering today, but the first and probably the easiest to get used to is to actually record it in ourselves using our computer keyboard as a kind of proxy instrument. So we're now going to bring back that little keyboard tool we had from before. If we simply come up to Window up here and then Show Musical Typing, we'll be shown this keyboard type interface, which are the keys of the piano mapped to our computer keyboard. So if I go ahead and either click one of these buttons, we can hear a pitch, we can hear the piano playing back the data we're sending it, or I can actually press my keyboard. So this is great, very, very simple to use. And there are just a few other features to mention. These two buttons down here, so Z and X on your keyboard, or again we could click them. These will shift the octave of the pitch we're playing, so how high or low the pitches we're using are. As I press them, you can see up here that the selection of the keyboard shifts to the left or right. So to the right, for anyone unfamiliar, are higher notes on a piano. So by me pressing either X on my keyboard or this plus here, we're getting a higher range of notes. And similarly, if I go down, we'll have a lower range. So moving on, we'll put it back to about the middle and check the range. So with that set up, programming MIDI data can actually be as simple as performing that into GarageBand and recording it, which is simply to say, we'll come up here to the transport and hit record, or we can press R in our keyboard as a shortcut for record. We'll get a short count in and I can play on my computer keyboard to program in some data. So let's try that now. Great, so now what we've done is programmed some MIDI data for this piano software instrument to play back. You'll see it represented here as a collection of different data points. So going up and down with the shape of the melody, placed where we've performed them in the bar. But of course we can change this instrument. So we've heard it on a piano. And now we can go and change this track, just with the track selected, to another one of the instruments available here. So we could choose an acoustic guitar. And similarly, we could change to a type of mallet, like a marimba, or any range of synthesizer type sounds. So MIDI is highly flexible that way. It's an extremely versatile way to try to create music. And just one final thing to note before we get into programming drums specifically, is that just like our samples and loops, we can open up an editing interface. So with our recorded region here, I can double click it to open up a MIDI editor interface. I'll just close this keyboard tool for the moment. And we can see here all of our recorded data. Now with this, because MIDI is so flexible, because it's not fixed recorded audio, we can actually manipulate it quite easily. So we can select all of that and then drag it up to a different pitch. So one, that's a very quick and easy way to transpose with MIDI, but then further, unlike audio, we can actually move individual notes. And in audio, we couldn't pick that apart before without extensive editing. So I could take this specific note and decide I don't like it, so delete it, or I could drag it to a different pitch. So like this. And then similarly, I can drag the edges of notes to increase their duration, so how long the note's held for, or come down here to this velocity bar to change how loud and forcefully the note is played. So not just changing the volume, but the actual tone of the instrument. But yes, now that we've seen this interface, we'll get into drums specifically. I'll delete this small clip we've made, and then I'll change this track here, this software instrument track, to a drum kit. So I'll come to drum kit, I'll just select one of them, and then we can start trying to program our own drum beat. So again, like with melodic material, we could come up to Window, Show Musical Typing, or Command K on the keyboard for a shortcut to bring up this same keyboard tool. And even though this is representative of a keyboard, because it's MIDI data, each of these different keys can be triggering a different part of the drum. So an A, for instance, might trigger a kick drum, pressing S might trigger a snare, all depending on which instrument you've loaded up. So the first thing I'd encourage is clicking some of these notes to see what we're hearing. So there we can hear some different tom drums and some cymbals. But generally on most drum kits, there'll be a specific octave, so a specific highlighted section of this keyboard here, where you'll have a kick, a snare, and a hi-hat readily available. So just like we looked at last week with samples, we're going to start with those same building blocks today with MIDI programming. So generally it's going to be the octave C1. So if I go down one further octave here, we'll be at C1, and then I should be able to press A for a kick drum, S for a snare drum, and then T for a hi-hat. Beyond that, I can also press U for an open hi-hat, O for a crashing cymbal, and then P for a ride cymbal. And that layout should actually be reflected in most of GarageBand's different drum kits that are available. So generally you should be able to come to C1, the octave, and then use those keys there as the basic building blocks of a drum beat. So yes, the first approach we're going to look at is actually playing them in ourselves, so recording the data. And this is really good because you get an embodied sense of the rhythm. You can try it out in real time and record new layers on top of the drum beat you're already making really easily. So let's just go to the start of the project. I'm going to hit record and then put 2 hi-hats on every beat, like this. Great, so now we have that as a starting point, but you may have noticed that because I'm using a keyboard, the timing's kind of clunky. I will have played some notes too early and some too late, but again, because MIDI is very flexible, we can fix this quite quickly and easily. So again, if I go and open up the MIDI editor, either by double-clicking this region or clicking the editor tool here, the scissors, and I'll just move this tool again, I can actually highlight all of this data that I've just recorded and then use a feature called quantization. And what quantization does is snap your performance to the different beats and divisions of beats that you've set for your project. So with all of that highlighted, I can simply press this Q here. You'll see that each of those notes have subtly shifted and now they're very strictly even. So let's have a listen. Good, so now they're in very strict, perfect timing, which is great because you don't have to perform things in with any great degree of accuracy. So now with that starting point of our hi-hats, let's go back to the beginning and try to add a kick drum. Once more, we'll come to the beginning and hit record. And again, because MIDI is quite flexible, it won't actually record over our hi-hats. We can record another drum layer and it will just add it to that mix. So let's try that now. So again, you'll see those extra little data points have been contributed, representing the kick drum, but they haven't overridden any of the hi-hat. Also, once more, I'll move this window and then we can come down and quantize our kick drums so that they're in perfect time. So we'll press Q and you'll again see that they've all subtly shifted to line up perfectly with the beats and divisions of those beats. So let's have a listen. Great. So this very much resembles the way that we built a drum beat last week. It's a very similar process, except we're programming performance data rather than arranging recorded samples. So again, like last week, just to start off with, I'll add a snare on the 2nd and 4th beat of each bar. And again, once more, we can highlight those notes and quantize them to snap them to the bar. So let's have a listen to all of that together. Great, so now we have a basic drum beat that we've actually programmed in ourselves just with MIDI data. As with recorded audio, we can loop this data for as long as we need to. Or similarly, we can drag this little cell that we've created around and rearrange it just as if it was a loop. But again, now with the added flexibility of us being able to edit individual notes. So I'll zoom in just a little with this little bar here. We'll just zoom in our actual MIDI editor. And I could now take each of these notes and decide that I want them played not only louder, but a little harder. So changing the tone as well. I'll bring them all up and let's have a listen. you can hear that the snare has a bit more of a crack in it, rather than just being louder in volume. So again, the other thing I could do with this flexible MIDI framework, I could also move individual notes. So say I wanted this kick to fall a little later in the bar, and same as this one, I can move them and they'll also snap to the bars, just like when I try to move audio samples. So let's listen. Of course, we can delete or lengthen notes, but then finally we can also change which drum is being played very, very easily. So I could take all of these hi-hats here and move them all up to an open hi-hat instead. You'll hear as well that as I move them, it auditions in real time each of the different sounds. So you'll be able to get a quick idea of what each one does. Same as if you click a data point, you'll hear it sound. So again, very accessible, very easy to use. Let's go back and listen with open hi-hats. Yeah, so hopefully you can see how flexible this is as a method of actually writing your own drum beats. What I'll do now is delete that one I've just created and show you a more directly performative way of building a drum beat like this. So we can delete this section here. We'll come back to the start and I'll record both a kick and a snare drum at the same time. And this is a good place to start just to try out different drum beats in real time. So just with your two fingers, you can use the kick, so A and S for the snare, to try out different drum beats. I'll record one now just to demonstrate. Great, so now that we've got that recorded, of course, we can go ahead and clean up the timing a little by using quantization, so this little cue here. And then if we want to go ahead and add some symbols up the top, like before, we can simply record over the top of this data. So I'll hit record and add some ride symbols with P, the P key. So here we go. So as usual, I'll just quantize those. Let's have a listen to the whole drum beat. Great, so now we've really quickly and easily built a drum beat, which we can also edit in great detail. And with this method, we can go ahead and start adding pitch instruments quite quickly. So if I were to come up to this plus and add another software instrument track, so here, we can use this same method to actually record some pitch data over the top. So I'll move this window. We might come and select a mallet, say a marimba. We'll play something on the keyboard to listen to how high it is. And if that's a little low, we may want it higher, so we'll push up some octaves here. Great, so let's use that and see if we can record something pitched over the top, just in the same way. Great, so there we go. I'll move this window once more. I'll double click that field we just recorded, and then quantize all of those notes so that they're in time. And now let's have a listen. Of course, you could just loop these sections like we did before. You could use this cycle region up here to hear things over and over again if you're trying to audition different parts of a drum beat, or maybe you're trying out different layers that you might add in real time while it's playing back to you and looping. So that's just a quick guide to actually using this keyboard feature to program in not only drums but some melodic content if you're ready to go ahead and try that. We will be revisiting using software instruments and MIDI to create melody later in the semester as we come up to the third assessment. But again, I'd encourage you to go ahead and try, see if you can use this editor down here or this keyboard tool here to record in some data. So one last thing to look at just before we finish up is the kind of alternate way that we can program in data if you don't want to perform it in physically with this keyboard function. So I'll turn off this cycle range and I'll just take this little region that we've created before and then copy it further in the project here. And I'll double click this one to make sure this is the one we're looking at for editing. So then I'll leave all of these ride symbols up here, but delete all of these lower notes on the kick and snare that we've recorded. And what I'm demonstrating now is that we can actually program this data by hand rather than performing it in. So if we hold our command key on the keyboard, our cursor will turn into a pencil tool, and then we can actually draw in our own note. So we can either simply click to place a note on the nearest beat or division, or we can actually drag out a duration, so for how long we want that note to last. But again, we might place a kick, then a snare, then another kick, and then a snare. So kicks on the first and third, snares on the second and fourth, just as a basic starting point. And now let's have a listen. Good, so then just like with the audio samples, we can then elaborate on that framework by drawing in additional notes. And this more resembles what we did last week. So again, we could draw in a little snare right before that kick, if we think one would sound good there. We can put in another little kick here, and then perhaps one right after that snare. And again, if we want to listen to this on repeat, we can just drag a loop region for the duration of what we've written, so that now when we press play, we'll just hear it on repeat, making it easy to audition. So we'll press play. Great, so if we're now happy with that drum beat, what we could do is take this region up here and trim it back to what we've just programmed so we don't need the second half anymore. And then just like audio samples, use this as a region to loop throughout our song. So we can drag out a loop duration, or copy it around, and etc. So hopefully that's given you a nice accessible kind of introduction to MIDI and using software instruments. To wrap up briefly, I'll just discuss the kind of benefit and the disadvantages of MIDI more broadly. So the benefit of MIDI is that it's flexible, it's very easy to manipulate. We can quickly change the instrument or the types of notes being played or their duration, and a whole range of different parameters very easily, which we can't always do with audio samples. So that sounds great, that sounds very versatile, but then similarly there's a disadvantage in MIDI in that it generally doesn't have as high a sound quality as recorded audio. But again, software instruments, so what we use to actually play the MIDI data, have improved vastly over the years. You'll hear a lot of software instruments in different game and film soundtracks now, alongside actual recorded instruments to kind of bring up the production value. And it's also a budget thing, because MIDI instruments are a lot cheaper than hiring actual recording artists. So it can be a quick way in this kind of digital era for someone just with a laptop to program their own music. It's made everything much more accessible. So with that all covered, your creative exercise for this week would be to try to use MIDI programming and software instruments to construct your own drum beat like we've done here today. If you'd like to explore, go ahead and add other instruments and try to use some pitched data, so try to program in an actual melody or something like that. But again, we will revisit that later in the semester more specifically. But yeah, see if you can construct a drum beat similar to what you might have built last week, but with MIDI programming. As always, if you have any questions, direct them to the forums or in our online Collaborate sessions, and I hope you all enjoy. Thanks.